There is no first principle of criticism. A philosopher is compelled to follow the maxim of epic poets and to plunge in medias res. The origin of things, if things have an origin, cannot be revealed to me, if revealed at all, until I have traveled very far from it, and many revolutions of the sun must precede my first dawn. The light, as it appears, hides the candle. Perhaps there is no source of things at all, no simpler form from which they are evolved, but only an endless succession of different complexities. In that case, nothing would be lost by joining the procession wherever one happens to come upon it, and following it as long as one's legs hold out. Everyone might still observe a typical bit of it, but would not have understood anything better if he had seen more things. He would only have had more to explain. The very notion of understanding or explaining anything would then be absurd. Yet this notion is drawn from a current presumption or experience, to the effect that, in some directions at least, things do grow out of simpler things. Bread can be baked, and dough and fire and an oven are conjoined in baking it. Such an episode is enough to establish the notion of origins and explanations, without at all implying that the dough and the hot oven are themselves primary facts. A philosopher may accordingly perfectly well undertake to find episodes of evolution in the world. Parents with children, storms with shipwrecks, passions with tragedies. If he begins in the middle, he will still begin at the beginning of something, and perhaps as much at the beginning of things as he could possibly begin. On the other hand, this whole supposition may be wrong. Things may have had some simpler origin, or may contain simpler elements. In that case, it will be incumbent on the philosopher to prove this fact, that is, to find in the complex present objects evidence of their composition out of simples. But in this proof, also, he would be beginning in the middle, and he would reach origins or elements only at the end of his analysis. The case is similar with respect to first principles of discourse. They can never be discovered, if discovered at all, until they have been long taken for granted and employed in the very investigation which reveals them. The more cogent a logic is, the fewer and simpler its first principles will turn out to have been. But in discovering them and deducing the rest from them, they must first be employed unawares, if they are the principles lending cogency to actual discourse, so that the mind must trust current presumptions no less in discovering that they are logical, that is, justified by more general, unquestioned presumptions, than in discovering that they are arbitrary and merely instinctive. It is true that, quite apart from living discourse, a set of axioms and postulates, as simple as we like, may be posited in the air, and deductions drawn from them ad libitum. But such pure logic is a choice, unless we find or assume that discourse or nature actually follows it, and it is not by deduction from first principles arbitrarily chosen that human reasoning actually proceeds, but by loose habits of mental evocation, which such principles at best may exhibit afterwards in an idealized form. Moreover, if we could strip our thought from the arena of perfect logic, we should be performing perhaps a remarkable dialectical feat, but this feat would be a mere addition to the complexities of nature and no simplification. This motley world, besides its other antics, would then contain logicians and their sports. If by chance, on turning to the following facts, we found by analysis that they obeyed that ideal logic, we should again be beginning with things as we find them in the gross, and not with first principles. It may be observed in passing that no logic to which empire over nature or over human discourse has ever been ascribed has been a cogent logic. It has been, in proportion to its exemplification in existence, a mere description, psychological or historical, of an actual procedure. Whereas pure logic, when at last, quite recently, it was clearly conceived, turned out instantly to have no necessary application to anything, and to be merely a parabolic excursion into the realm of essence. In the tangle of human beliefs, as conventionality expressed in talk and in literature, it is easy to distinguish a compulsory factor called facts or things from a more optional and argumentative factor called suggestion or interpretation. Not that what we call facts are at all indubitable or composed of immediate data, but that in the direction of fact we come much sooner to a stand and feel that we are safe from criticism. To reduce conventional beliefs to the facts they rest on, however questionable those facts themselves may be in other ways, is to clear our intellectual conscience of voluntary or avoidable delusion. If what we call a fact still deceives us, we feel we are not to blame. We should not call it a fact till we see any way of eluding the recognition of it. To reduce conventional belief to the recognition of matters of fact is empirical criticism of knowledge. The more drastic this criticism is, and the more revolutionary the view to which it reduces me, the clearer will be the contrast between what I find I know and what I thought I knew. But if these plain facts were all I had to go on, how did I reach those strange conclusions? What principles of interpretation, what tendencies to feign, what habits of inference were at work in me? For if nothing in the facts justified my beliefs, something in me must have suggested them. To disentangle and formulate these subjective principles of interpretation is transcendental criticism of knowledge. Transcendental criticism in the hands of Kant and his followers was a skeptical instrument used by persons who were not skeptics. They accordingly imported into their argument many uncritical assumptions, such as that these tendencies to fame must be the same in everybody, that the notions of nature, history, or mind, which they led people to adopt, were the right or standard notions on these subjects, and that it was glorious rather than ignominious or sophistical to build on these principles an encyclopedia of false sciences and to call it knowledge. A true skeptic will begin by throwing over all those academic conventions as so much confessed fiction, and he will ask rather if, when all that these arbitrary tendencies to feign import into experience has been removed, any factual element remains at all. The only critical function of transcendentalism is to drive empiricism home and challenge it to produce any knowledge of fact whatsoever, and empirical criticism will not be able to do so, just as inattention leads ordinary people to assume as part of the given facts all that their unconscious transcendental logic has added to them. So inattention, at a deeper level, leads the empiricist to assume an existence in his radical facts which does not belong to them. In standing helpless and resigned before them, he is, for all his assurance, obeying his illusions rather than their evidence. Thus, transcendental criticism, used by a thorough skeptic, may compel empirical criticism to show its hand. It had mistaken its cards and was bluffing without knowing it. Dogma and doubt. Custom does not breed understanding, but takes its place, teaching people to make their way contentedly through the world without knowing what the world is, nor what they think of it, nor what they are. When their attention is attracted to some remarkable thing, say to the rainbow, this thing is not analyzed nor examined from various points of view, but all the casual resources of the fancy are called forth in conceiving it, and this total reaction of the mind precipitates a dogma. The rainbow is taken for an omen or for a trace left in the sky by the passage of some beautiful and elusive goddess. Such a dogma, far from being an interpretation or identification of thought with the truth of the object, is a fresh and additional object in itself. The original passive perception remains unchanged. The thing remains unfathomed, and as its diffuse influence has by chance bred one dogma today, it may breed a different dogma tomorrow. We have therefore, as we progress in our acquaintance with the world, an always greater confusion. Besides the original fantastic inadequacy of our perceptions, we have now rival clarifications of them, and a new uncertainty as to whether these dogmas are relevant to the original object, or are themselves really clear, or if so, which of them is true. Prosperous dogmatism is indeed not impossible. We may have such determinate minds that the suggestions of experience always issue there in the same dogmas, and these orthodox dogmas, perpetually revived by the stimulus of things, may become our dominant or even our sole apprehension of them. We shall really have moved to another level of mental discourse. We shall be living on ideas. In the gardens of Seville, I once heard, coming through the tangle of palms and orange trees, the troubled voice of a pupil in the theological seminary, crying to his playmate, "You booby, of course angels have a more perfect nature than men." With his black and red cassock, that child had put on dialectic. He was playing the game of dogma and dreaming in words, and was insensible to the scent of violets that filled the air. How long would that last? Hardly, I suspect, until the next spring, and the troubled awakening which puberty would presently bring to that little dogmatist sooner or later overtakes all elder dogmatists in the press of the world. The more perfect the dogmatism, the more insecure. A great high-top sail that can never be reefed nor furled is the first carried away by the gale. To me, the opinions of mankind, taken without any contrary prejudice, since I have no rival opinions to propose, but simply contrasted with the course of nature, seem surprising fictions, and the marvel is how they can be maintained. What strange religions, what ferocious moralities, what slavish fashions, what sham interests. I can explain it all only by saying to myself that intelligence is naturally forthright. It forges ahead. It piles fiction on fiction, and the fact that the dogmatistic structure, for the time being, stands and grows, passes for a proof of its rightness. Right indeed is it in one sense, as vegetation is right. It is vital, it has plasticity and warmth, and a certain indirect correspondence with its soil and climate. Many obviously fabulous dogmas, like those of religion, might forever dominate the most active minds, except for one circumstance. In the jungle, one tree strangles another, and luxuriance itself is murderous. So is luxuriance in the human mind. What kills spontaneous fictions, what recalls the impassioned fancy from its improvisation, is the angry voice of some contrary fancy. Nature, silently making fools of us all our lives, never would bring us to our senses, but the maddest assertions of the mind may do so, when they challenge one another. Criticism arises out of the conflict of dogmas. May I escape the predicament and criticize without a dogmatic criterion? Hardly, for though the criticism may be expressed hypothetically, as for instance in saying that if any child knew his own father, he would be a wise child. Yet the point on which doubt is thrown is a point of fact, and that there are fathers and children is assumed dogmatically. If not, however obscure the essential relation between fathers and children might be ideally, no one could be wise or foolish in assigning it in any particular instance, since no such terms would exist in nature at all. Skepticism is a suspicion of error about facts, and to suspect error about facts is to share the enterprise of knowledge, in which facts are presupposed and error is possible. The skeptic thinks himself shrewd, and often is so. His intellect, like the intellect he criticizes, may have some inkling of the true hang and connection of things. He may have pierced to a truth of nature behind current illusions. Since his criticism may thus be true and his doubt well grounded, they are certainly assertions, and if he is sincerely a skeptic, they are assertions which he is ready to maintain stoutly. Skepticism is accordingly a form of belief. Dogma cannot be abandoned. It can only be revised in view of some more elementary dogma which it has not yet occurred to the skeptic to doubt. As he may be right in every point of his criticism, except in fancying that his criticism is radical and that he is altogether a skeptic. This vital compulsion to posit and to believe something, even in the act of doubting, would nevertheless be ignominious if the beliefs which life and intelligence forced upon me were always false. I should then be obliged to honor the skeptic for his heroic though hopeless effort to eschew belief, and I should despise the dogmatist for his willing subservience to illusion. The sequel will show, I trust, that this is not the case, that intelligence is by nature veridical, and that its ambition to reach the truth is sane and capable of satisfaction, even if each of its efforts actually fails. To convince me of this fact, however, I must first justify my faith in many subsidiary beliefs concerning animal economy and the human mind and the world they flourish in. That skepticism should intervene in philosophy at all is an accident of human history, due to much unhappy experience of perplexity and error. If all had gone well, assertions would be made spontaneously in dogmatic innocence, and the very notion of a right to make them would seem as gratuitous as in fact it is, because all the realms of being lie open to a spirit plastic enough to conceive them, and those that have ears to hear may hear. Nevertheless, in the confused state of human speculation, this embarrassment obtrudes itself automatically, and a philosopher today would be ridiculous and negligible who had not strained his dogmas through the utmost rigors of skepticism, and who did not approach every opinion, whatever his own ultimate faith, with the courtesy and smile of the skeptic. The brute necessity of believing something so long as life lasts does not justify any belief in particular, nor does it assure me that Not to live would not, for this very reason, be far safer and saner. To be dead and have no opinions would certainly not be to discover the truth, but if all opinions are necessarily false, it would at least be not to sin against intellectual honor. Let me then push skepticism as far as I logically can, and endeavor to clear my mind of illusion, even at the price of intellectual suicide. Wayward skepticism. Criticism surprises the soul in the arms of convention. Children insensibly accept all the suggestions of sense and language, the only initiative they show being a certain willfulness in the extension of these notions, a certain impulse towards private superstition. This is soon corrected by education or broken off rudely, like the nails of a tender hand, by hard contact with custom, fact, or derision. Belief then settles down in sullenness and apathy to a narrow circle of vague assumptions, to none of which the mind need have any deep affinity, none of which it need really understand, but which nevertheless it clings to for lack of other footing. The philosophy of the common man is an old wife that gives him no pleasure, yet he cannot live without her, and resents any aspersions that strangers may cast on her character. Of this homely philosophy, the tender cuticle is religious belief, really the least vital and most arbitrary part of human opinion, the outer ring, as it were, of the fortification of prejudice, but for that very reason the most jealously defended, since it is on being attacked there, at the least defensible point, that rage and alarm at being attacked at all are first aroused in the citadel. People are not naturally skeptics, wondering if a single one of their intellectual habits can be reasonably preserved. They are dogmatists angrily confident of maintaining them all. Integral minds, peoples of a single coherent tradition, regard their religion, whatever it may be, as certain, as sublime, and as the only rational basis of morality and policy. Yet, in fact, religious belief is terribly precarious, partly because it is arbitrary, so that in the next tribe or in the next century it will wear quite a different form, and partly because, when genuine, it is spontaneous and continually remodeled, like poetry, in the heart that gives it birth. A man of the world soon learns to discredit established religions on account of their variety and absurdity, although he may good-naturedly continue to conform to his own. And a mystic before long begins fervently to condemn current dogmas on account of his own different inspiration. Without philosophical criticism, therefore, mere experience and good sense suggest that all positive religions are false, or at least, which is enough for my present purpose, that they are all fantastic and insecure. Closely allied with religious beliefs, there are usually legends and histories, dramatic if not miraculous, and a man who knows anything of literature and has observed how histories are written, even in the most enlightened times, needs no satirist to remind him that all histories, in so far as they contain a system, a drama, or a moral, are so much literary fiction, and probably disingenuous. Common sense, however, will still admit that there are recorded facts not to be doubted. as it will admit that there are obvious physical facts. And it is here when popular philosophy has been reduced to a kind of positivism that the speculative critic may well step upon the scene. Criticism, I have said, has no first principle, and its desultory character may be clearly exhibited at this point by asking whether the evidence of science or that of history should be questioned first. I might impugn the belief in physical facts reported by the senses and by natural science, such as the existence of a ring of Saturn, reducing them to appearances, which are facts reported by personal remembrance. And this is actually the choice made by British and German critics of knowledge, who, relying on memory and history, have denied the existence of anything but experience. Yet the opposite procedure would seem more judicious. Knowledge of the facts reported by history is mediated by documents which are physical facts, and these documents must first be discovered and believed to have subsisted unknown and to have had a more or less remote origin in time and place before they can be taken as evidence for any mental events. For if I did not believe that there had been any men in Athens, I should not imagine they had had any thoughts. Even personal memory, when it professes to record any distant experience, can recognize and place this experience only by first reconstructing the material scene in which it occurred. Memory records moral events in terms of their physical occasions, and if the latter are merely imaginary, the former must be doubly so, like the thoughts of a personage in a novel. My remembrance of the past is a novel I am constantly recomposing, and it would not be a historical novel, but sheer fiction, if the material events which mark and balance my career had not their public dates and characters scientifically discoverable. Romantic solipsism, in which the self making up the universe is a moral person endowed with memory and vanity, is accordingly untenable. Not that it is unthinkable or self-contradictory, because all the complementary objects which might be requisite to give point and body to the idea of oneself might be only ideas and not facts. And a solitary deity imagining a world or remembering his own past constitutes a perfectly conceivable universe. But this imagination would have no truth and this remembrance no control, so that the fond belief of such a deity that he knew his own past would be the most groundless of dogmas. And while by chance the dogma might be true, that deity would have no reason to think it so. At the first touch of criticism, he would be obliged to confess that his alleged past was merely a picture now before him, and that he had no reason to suppose that this picture had had any constancy in successive moments, or that he had lived through previous moments at all. Nor could any new experience ever lend any color or corroboration to such a pathological conviction. This is obvious, so that the romantic solipsism, although perhaps an interesting state of mind, is not a position capable of defense, and any solipsism which is not a solipsism of the present moment is logically contemptible. The postulates on which empirical knowledge and inductive science are based, namely, that there has been a past, that it was such as it is now thought to be, there will be a future, and that it must, for some inconceivable reason, resemble the past and obey the same laws. These are all gratuitous dogmas. The skeptic, in his honest retreat, knows nothing of a future, and has no need of such an unwarrantable idea. He may perhaps have images before him of zines, somehow not in the foreground, with a sense of before and after running through the texture of them, and he may call this background of his sentiency the past. But the relative obscurity and evanescence of these phantoms will not prompt him to suppose that they have retreated to obscurity from the light of day. They will be to him simply what he experiences them as being, denizens of the twilight. It would be a vain fancy to imagine that these ghosts had once been men. They are simply nether gods, native to the Erebus they inhabit. The world present to the skeptic may continue to fade into these opposite abysses, the past and the future, but having renounced all prejudice and checked all customary faith, you will regard both as painted abysses only, like the opposite exits to the country and to the city on the ancient stage. He will see the masked actors, and he will invent a reason, rushing frantically out on one side and in at the other. But he knows that the moment they are out of sight, the play is over for them. Those outlying regions and those reported events, which the messengers narrate so impressively, are pure fancy, and there is nothing for him but to sit in his seat and lend his mind to the tragic illusion. The solstice thus becomes an incredulous spectator of his own romance, thinks his own adventures fictions, and accepts the solipsism of the present moment. This is an honest position, and certain attempts to refute it as self-contradictory are based on a misunderstanding. For example, it is irrelevant to urge that the present moment cannot comprise the whole of existence because the phrase a present moment implies a chain of moments, or that the mind that calls any moment the present moment virtually transcends it and posits a past and a future beyond it. These arguments confuse the convictions of the solipsist with those of a spectator describing him from outside. The skeptic is not committed to the implications of other men's language, nor can he be convicted out of his own mouth by the names he is obliged to bestow on the details of his momentary vision. There may be long vistas in it. There may be many figures of men and beasts, many legends and apocalypses depicted on his canvas. There may even be a shadowy frame about it, or the suggestion of a gigantic ghostly something on the hither side of it, which he may call himself. This wealth of objects is not inconsistent with solipsism, although the implication of the conventional terms in which those objects are described may render it difficult for the solipsist always to remember his solitude. Yet, when he reflects, he perceives it, and all his heroic efforts are concentrated on not asserting and not implying anything, but simply noticing what he finds. Skepticism is not concerned to abolish ideas. It can relish the variety and order of a pictured world, or of any number of them in succession, without any of the qualms and exclusions proper to dogmatism. His case is simply not to credit these ideas, not to posit any of these fancied worlds, nor this ghostly mind imagined as viewing them. The attitude of the skeptic is not inconsistent, it is merely difficult, because it is hard for the greedy intellect to keep its cake without eating it. Very voracious dogmatists like Spinoza even assert that it is impossible, but The impossibility is only psychological, and due to their veracity, they no doubt speak truly for themselves when they say that the idea of a horse, if not contradicted by some other idea, is the belief that the horse exists. But this would not be the case if they felt no impulse to ride that imagined horse or to get out of its way. Ideas become beliefs only when, by precipitating tendencies to action, they persuade me that they are signs of things, and these things are not those ideas simply hypostasized, but are believed to be compacted of many parts, and full of ambushed powers entirely absent from the ideas. The belief is imposed on me surreptitiously by a latent mechanical reaction of my body on the object producing the idea. It is by no means implied in any qualities obvious to the idea. Such a latent reaction, being mechanical, can hardly be avoided, but it may be discounted in reflection if a man has experience and the poise of a philosopher, and skepticism is not the less honorable for being difficult when it is inspired by a firm determination to probe this confused and terrible apparition of life to the bottom. So far is solipsism of the present moment from being self-contradictory that it might, under other circumstances, be the normal and invincible attitude of the spirit, and I suspect it may be that of many animals. The difficulties I find in maintaining it consistently come from the social and laborious character of human life. A creature whose whole existence was passed under a hard shell or was spent in a free flight might find nothing paradoxical or acrobatic in solipsism, nor would he feel the anguish which men feel in doubt, because doubt leaves them defenseless and undecided in the presence of oncoming events. A creature whose actions were predetermined might have a clearer mind. He might keenly enjoy the momentary scene, never conceiving himself as a separate body or as anything but the unity of that scene, nor his enjoyment as anything but its beauty, nor would he harbor the least suspicion that it would change or perish, nor any objection to its doing so if it chose. Solipsism would then be selflessness, and skepticism simplicity. They would not be open to disruption from within. The ephemeral insect would accept the evidence of his ephemeral object. Whatever quality this might chance to have, he would not suppose, as Descartes did, that in thinking anything his own existence was involved. Being newborn himself, with only this one innate and also experimental idea, he would bring to his single experience no extraneous habits of interpretation or inference, and he would not be troubled by doubts, because he would believe nothing. For men, however, who are long-lived and teachable animals, solipsism of the present moment is a violent pose, permitted only to the young philosopher in his first intellectual despair, and even he often cheats himself when he thinks he assumes it, and professing to stand on his head really, like a clumsy acrobat, rests on his hands also. The very terms solipsism and present moment betray this impurity. An actual intuition which, by hypothesis, is fresh, absolute, and not to be repeated, is called and is perhaps conceived as an ipsa, a self-same man. But identity, as I shall have occasion to observe in discussing identity in essences, implies two moments, two instances, or two intuitions between which it obtains. Similarly, a present moment suggests other moments and an adventitious limitation either in duration or in scope, but the solstice and his world, which are not distinguishable, have by hypothesis no environment whatsoever, and nothing limits them save the fact that there is nothing more. These irrelevancies and side glances are imported into the mind of the skeptic because, in fact, he is retreating into solipsism from a far more ambitious philosophy. A thought naturally momentary would be immune from them. A perfect solipsist, therefore, hardly is found among men, but some men are zealous in bringing their criticism down to solipsism of the present moment, just because this attitude enables them to cast away everything that is not present in their prevalent mood or in their deepest thought, and to set up this chosen object as the absolute. Such a compensatory dogma is itself not critical, but criticism may help to raise it to a specious eminence by lopping off everything else. What remains will be different in different persons. Some say it is Brahma, some that it is pure being, some that it is the idea or law of the moral world. Each of these absolutes is the sacred residuum which the temperament of different philosophers or of different nations clings to, and will not criticize. And in each case it is contrasted with the world in which the vulgar believe as something deeper, simpler, and more real. Perhaps when solipsism of the present moment is reached by a philosopher trained in abstraction and inclined to ecstasy, his experience at this depth of concentration will be that of an extreme tension, which is also liberty, an emptiness which is intensest light, and his denial of all natural facts and events, which he will call illusions, will culminate in the fervent assertion that all is one, and that one is Brahma, or the breath of life. On the other hand, a scientific observer and reasoner who has pried into substance and has learned that all the aspects of nature are relative and variable may still not deny the existence of matter in every object, and this element of mere intensity, drawn from the sense of mere actuality in himself, may lead him to assert that pure being is, and everything else is not. Finally, a secondary mind, fed on books, may drop the natural emphasis which objects of sense have for the living animal, and may retain, as the sole filling of its present moment, nothing but the sciences. The philosopher will then balance his denial of material facts by asserting the absolute reality of his knowledge of them. This reality, however, will extend no farther than his information, as some intensest moment of recollection may gather it together, and his personal idea of the world, so composed and so limited, will seem to him the sole existence. His universe will be the after-image of his learning. We may notice that in these three instances, skepticism has not suspended affirmation, but has rather intensified it, pouring it all on the devoted head of one chosen object. There is a tireless and deafening vehemence about these skeptical prophets. It betrays the poor old human psyche laboring desperately within them in the shipwreck of her native hopes and refusing to die. Her sacrifice, she believes, will be her salvation, and she passionately identifies what remains to her with all she has lost, and by an audacious falsehood persuades herself she has lost nothing. Thus, the temper of these skeptics is not at all skeptical. They take their revenge on the world which eluded them when they tried to prove its existence, by asserting the existence of the remnant which they have still by them, insisting that this, and this only, is the true and perfect world, and a much better one than the false world in which the heathen trust. Such infatuation in the sophist, however, is not inevitable. No such exorbitant credit need be given to the object, perhaps a miserable one, which still fills the skeptical mind, and a more dispassionate skepticism, while contemplating that object, may disallow it.